everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Crazy stuff to talk about today. So, today we're going to start talking about a topic that it might be in the back of your head. You're like, there seems to be something really important that takes place at our country's founding. And we have not talked about it yet. This is kind of weird. If that's been in the back of your mind, we're going to talk about it today because it is a pivotal part, if not one of the absolute most pivotal parts of American history, and that's slavery. Let's get started. Let's talk about slavery in the United States. All right. So, slavery, all right, we got a picture here. This is from the beginning, more or less, but give or take a couple years. African slaves started being brought to the New World for labor, to work on plantations and farms. The reason that Africans were chosen, all right, is because Africans naturally were less likely to get sick from the climate in the southern part of what's present-day America and in South America. So the center of the slave trade, when the slaves would be brought to the United States or brought to the New World from Africa, was actually in the Caribbean, and then they'd be spread out. Brazil is outside of the United States, which is the main importer of slaves. Brazil also was an importer of slaves as well. It is an important part of this story, all right, because to understand slavery in the United States. So the reason because I'm your US history teacher. I don't know if you'll ever have anybody explain this to you as clearly as this again. So I want to make sure I'm very clear on this. One thing that I don't usually have to teach my students is that slavery existed in the United States and it was awful and it was evil. Everybody generally knows that, all right? That's not a new fact to anybody. What ends up happening, though, is your perception of slavery in the United States gets presented throughout history whenever you hear the term slave. The Bible talks about slaves. Rome had slaves. Slavery is a common aspect of the world. Sometimes people try to justify the fact that slavery around the world, since it has existed everywhere, it's just a natural aspect of civilization. It is not. The American version of slavery, the New World, calls Brazil, again, we're going to use them as an example here. Brazil and the United States have a different version of slavery called chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, now granted, all slavery is evil. If you're going to rank them the least evil to most evil, chattel slavery is pretty much the most evil. All right. So slavery has existed. Basically, if you defeated another army in combat, those soldiers will become slaves. Usually, all right, if they're slaves for life, it's because of the choice they made, whether it's losing in combat or something like that. That was a pretty severe form of slavery. Usually, if you get in debt somewhere in one of these other civilizations that have allowed slavery, you become a slave for a certain amount of time until your debt is paid. That is common. Also, evil. But that was common. Once your debt is paid, you're free. Chattel slavery is a whole level of psycho that really didn't exist prior to this idea. Chattel slavery is where if you become a slave, it is in perpetuity, forever. And you're like, oh yeah, that sucks, man. But isn't that kind of like you said, the soldiers sometimes in losing armies would be forced into slavery, sometimes they had to serve for life? No. Chattel slavery is way worse than that. Because if those soldiers had kids, their kids aren't slaves. Kids didn't fight in combat. Kids aren't slaves. Chattel slavery enslaves you and your entire lineage forever. That's crazy. All right. So the slaves that were brought to the New World were permanently, their kids. So these slaves would be born into slavery. I mean, that was pretty much unheard of. That just wasn't a thing that happened. People weren't born into slavery. So if you're born to a slave in a chattel slavery environment, which happened in the United States or the colonies at the time, and Brazil, again, I want to use Brazil as a specific example here today. That was forever. This is like next level evil with slavery. And it was very much dehumanizing. The Middle Passage that was taking place once slavery for hundreds of years coming across the Atlantic Ocean, they would just pack human beings from Africa on these ships to bring them over here to be slaves. Sometimes, and you may have heard this before if you've ever done any research, or this is new to you, that there were slaves in Africa, and that the colonists, the Europeans, whoever are buying the slaves, are buying them from, African owners of African slaves and then buying African slaves. So they were already slaves. Yeah, they might have already been slaves, not chattel slavery. They probably had a way of getting out of slavery, or at least their children weren't going to be enslaved. When they got sold into chattel slavery, it is permanent for your entire lineage. And tons of these humans died coming across the Atlantic Ocean over to the New World. So once these slaves got here, they were forced into farm labor. That was the main reason that slaves were used in the New World. There was rice, there was indigo, there was other things. The big cash crop at the time, all right, I'm talking 1600s into 1700s, once the colonies get up and running, is tobacco. The New World, like Virginia and North Carolina present day, have fantastic soil for growing tobacco. So slaves were used to grow tobacco, all right? Well, people knew it was messed up. They didn't want to talk about it because slaves were extremely expensive, and it was really hard to replace all that labor they needed to grow the tobacco and make money off of it. So everybody knew it was evil. And then the technology and the ability to grow tobacco and the science got better, and it got easier and easier to grow tobacco. Where if you had 50 slaves, you probably didn't need all 50 slaves anymore. And that's the only reason people had slaves, is for farming. And farming had gotten pretty advanced. It looks like, and I should also point this out, leading up to the Revolutionary War, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, because none of that mentions slavery. There's one little thing about the Three-Fifths Compromise, but that was more taxation more than actual slavery. Slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution. And there's this whole, millions of people are enslaved in the United States, never mentioned in the Constitution. Why is that? It's a unique situation, because when the Constitution is written and talked about in 1787, people know there is a lowering need for slaves. Don't really need them anymore. Tobacco is pretty easy to grow now. A lot of times when plantation owners will die, they'll, instead of like giving their slaves away, they will be super nice and freeing their slaves. But they had to wait till they were dead and didn't need them anymore. So I don't know if that makes it any better or actually might make it worse. Anyway. So when they're writing the Constitution, though, do we want to talk about slavery? Like, nah, because we know it's messed up. We know bringing slaves in from Africa to the New World is messed up. Everybody's angry, realizes that's wrong. All right. The North, right, because they don't grow as many crops because it's colder, they don't really have slavery anymore anyway. The South is the only place that has slavery. Now, in chattel slavery, throughout history, or whenever a version of this has existed, slaves do not, in these horrible conditions, do not reproduce fast enough to keep their population up. The only way to continue to keep a large slave population is bringing in more slaves. So, the Founding Fathers saw the writing on the wall. They knew pretty soon everybody in the world was going to outlaw this concept of allowing slavery to be brought in from Africa. And that's what happens in 1808. It's about 20 years later, so it wasn't that short, but that United States bans international slave trade. Can't bring in any more slaves. All right? This is why they knew this was going to happen when they wrote the Constitution. This is why they didn't talk about slavery. They thought slavery was going to go away on its own. Because once you stop bringing in slaves, the slave population can't sustain itself because slaves don't reproduce fast enough because of the work environment so brutal. They die faster than they are born. This has happened everywhere on earth. As soon as the slave trade gets banned in 1808, Brazil says, you know what? Obviously, this is not sustainable. We have to move away from it. And they freed all their slaves because they saw their slave population started to drop. So they freed all their slaves. This is exactly what was expected to happen in the United States. Any place else that had ever had chattel slavery before, you cut off the supply of new slaves and slavery collapses on itself and you move away from it. That's why the Constitution didn't mention it, because it should have taken care of itself. What's crazy, and people don't understand why this is. Historians, all the people that would be the scientists that would study these scenarios don't really understand why this is, but the fact of the matter is, when the new slave population gets cut off to America, America is the only place on earth ever in which the slave population continues to slightly grow. This was unexpected. When the slave population doesn't decrease without more slaves coming in, there is no push to get rid of it. And because of that, we're in a weird situation. That's why the Founding Fathers didn't mention it. They thought it would end when they cut off the slave trade. They cut off the slave trade, and for some reason, the only place on earth where chattel slaves produce offspring faster than the death rate. Now it's ruh-roh. Like, we were able to, all the people that were furious about it were like, hey, we're going to get rid of the international slave trade, it'll go away on its own. Clearly, that's not going to happen in America, and we're the only place on earth that doesn't happen. So how do we move forward now? So the question here is, while countries such as Brazil quickly abandoned slavery altogether after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, what odd anomaly happened in America that didn't happen elsewhere that allowed slavery to continue to exist in America? So, in the 1800s, there's a lot of people, not surprisingly, that hate slaves. But again, you shouldn't have to have a whole bunch of slaves, because everybody's growing tobacco and tobacco is getting easier to grow. You probably don't even need the slaves anyway. Then Eli Whitney, remember, talked about him yesterday, made interchangeable parts, makes a machine called the cotton gin. Fundamentally going to change America forever and pretty much the world, all right? This is what the cotton gin looks like, all right? Up here. The cotton gin, let me back up. Everybody wore wool. That's just what people wore around the world. You wear wool. It's hot, it's sticky. You live in England, it's fine. But if you live in warmer climates, and people have spread out to a lot of warmer climates like the South in the United States, or literally just summer anywhere, wool's not fun. What people would love to wear is silk, but that's extremely expensive, comes exclusively from China, or cotton. Cotton was wildly expensive. And the reason cotton is expensive is for a weird reason. Growing cotton isn't hard, all right? Cotton only grows up to about knee high. All you need is a lot of area and a warm climate. Cotton will grow. The problem is that if you've ever seen cotton fields, all right, when the cotton blooms, all right, it's like a little dandelion, like, oh, cotton ball, and you pick it out. However, if you've never grabbed one, you're not aware of this, there is a seed inside. It's like a nut almost that's inside the cotton ball, and you have to pull the fibers out of that seed, and it hurts your hands. It takes forever. It's really hard, but it's very, very strong. Just to get one cotton ball, all right, and you would need thousands of these cotton balls to make like a t-shirt, just have a cooler type of clothing. So growing cotton wasn't the problem. It was getting the seed out of it, which was so time consuming, nobody grew cotton. Eli Whitney creates this thing called the cotton gin, where, and that's all it is, this little box right here, just like interchangeable parts. He's famous for two things in history. Interchangeable parts helps the Industrial Revolution, and the cotton gin, which does not help the slaves at all, because the hardest part of growing cotton, getting the seed out, is now the easiest part. You take all these cotton balls with the seed in it, you drop it here on top of the ropes, you close that top lever, and a little more up close picture here. You close that top lever and it holds the seeds in place. You crank it and those ropes rip the cotton off the cotton seed. Rips the cotton off the cotton seed. And now the hardest part of growing cotton is now the easiest. Well, guess what everybody wants to start growing instead of tobacco now? Cotton. All these plantations in the South that were growing tobacco are growing cotton. The problem is, if they were growing 50 acres of tobacco, because see, tobacco has to get harvested in a certain amount of time or it goes bad. So you can't just leave it in the fields. Cotton doesn't do that. You can take your sweet time harvesting it. So people that were only growing 50 acres of tobacco because any more than that would rot are now growing 150 acres of cotton. Who's growing it? The slaves. The same amount of slaves that were used for 50 acres of tobacco are now having to do 150 acres of cotton. Well, why don't you get more slaves? There are no more slaves. The slave trade's over. The only slaves that you can get are the ones that are already here. The value of slaves skyrockets, all right? The South switches almost exclusively from tobacco, any place that's tobacco, unless you're North Carolina or Virginia with the natural soil. Basically, South Carolina down through Texas is referred to as the Cotton Belt because they grew cotton. And the only possible way to mass produce this amount of cotton, and these plantation owners got crazy rich off of this, because you know who's doing the work? Are the slaves. And their life is brutal because they're having to do 3 times the amount of work that they were. It's absolutely astronomically difficult. It is very dehumanizing. Movies always like to make slavery out to be this wildly awful situation. And they're like, all right, let's show how awful slaves are. And they're like, let's show a slave get beat. And they always do that, like one of the first scenes, like, oh man, slavery's bad. So people start to think the reason slavery is bad is because you could get whipped, which you absolutely could, which is a devastating punishment. It was relatively rare, as in most slaves would go their life with never being whipped, but it was absolutely excruciatingly, antagonizingly painful. That did happen. The reason slavery is so evil is because if you're a slave, you don't matter. Your existence is pointless. When you die, you may not even get a headstone at a grave. You'll just be buried out behind the plantation. If you're allowed to get married, the owner has to decide who you marry, and they're basically basing that on, will you have children that will be good workers? Completely dehumanized. If you have kids, they can just sell your kids because it's a profit if they want to. You have no say-so over your own life. There's no way out of it, and it's absolutely horrific, way more than the physical punishment or the difficulty of being a laborer, which a lot of people chose to do anyway. There's a lot of people who choose to be cotton farmers and aren't forced to do it as slavery. It's a tough job, but the fact that you don't exist is the pure evil of slavery. So the question here is, how did the invention of the cotton gin cause America to cling to the institution of slavery even more? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, the Missouri Compromise. You have to talk about slavery to understand why this is a tense situation. The tensions over slavery, all right? Because we're 1820. Remember 1808? Everybody was like, fine, I know slavery was bad. It's going to go away now. There's no more international slave trade. And then when the slave population doesn't naturally decrease, everybody's like, uh-oh. Like the North is like who is against slavery because they don't have, like, you know we're going to get rid of slavery, and the South is like, shut your face. This happened real quick. So there is tensions between states that are called free states, which don't allow slavery, and states that have slaves, all right, which are called slave states. So 1820, these tensions are already starting to be created, all right. Let me show you a map here. So all the states that are blue here, the New England states and the Midwest, present day, these are free states. Slavery is illegal. In the red states, slavery is allowed. There's 11 slave states and 11 free states. That's really important because they're equal in size. Now also look at this map, all right? If you notice, the blue line that runs over top of Texas, it says Spanish Mexico. Mexico owns that, all right? Mexico declared their independence. Mexico will own that land. That is, in Americans' mind, that is not our land. All right. Today, it's present day Texas, California, New Mexico, all that. At the time, that's not our land. So Missouri, all right, here on the map, here in the center, Missouri, a lot of people had moved out to Missouri because of manifest destiny. They had a lot of farms in Missouri that were using slaves. They asked America, can we join the United States? We want to be a slave state. Well, all the slave states are like, hooray, because as Missouri joins, that'll be 12 slave states to 11 free states. There is already a battle, figuratively, in Congress over slave states versus free states. The free states already, and this is an ongoing issue, I want you to understand this. The North hates slavery. The idea that you're going to go to South Carolina and make South Carolina get rid of slavery is a fantasy to even the most ardent anti-slavery people. The idea that the South would ever get rid of their slaves is crazy talk at this time. Now, granted, Civil War will happen, 13th Amendment. We know now slavery does get done away with. At the time, all you could hope for is this evil institution of slavery doesn't spread anywhere else, right? So the North doesn't want slavery to spread. Well, Missouri asked if they can join the United States, and the United States is like, sure. The United States loves having new states join. They're like, cool, we want to be a slave state. And existing slave states are like, yes. And the North is like, absolutely not. Like, we can't allow that to happen. And they argue and they argue and they argue. And this guy named Henry Clay comes out. He's nicknamed the Great Compromiser. But he comes up with this compromise, very famous because we're going to talk about it a lot moving forward, especially in this unit. He calls it the Missouri Compromise. It's a compromise dealing with Missouri coming in. Here's what it says, all right? The Missouri Compromise says, yes, Missouri, you get to come in as a free state. You get to come in as a slave state. And everybody in the South is like, hooray! And they're like, all right, Maine, and Maine's been out of this. They're like, got like 3 people that live there. They're like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah, Maine, you're actually going to join as a state too. I know you only got 3 people, but you're going to be a free state. This way we're at 12 slave states, 12 free states. And Maine's like, okay. So Maine joins the United States as well. Then, and this is the important one, there's a new rule for states when they join. It's the 3630 line. So the 3630 line, let me get out from here. It is the line that's on the top of North Carolina and Tennessee and then that Arkansas territory. That line, that is the 3630 line. It goes all the way around the globe, all right? The new rule is any state that comes in to the United States after the Missouri Compromise, all right, if you join the United States and you are above the 3630 line, you must required to be a free state. If you are below the 3630 line, all right, you have the option to be a slave state or a free state. Now look at this map. This is why this is really important. This is why the North agrees to allow Missouri to join as a slave state, allows slavery to expand a little bit. For all this unorganized territory and Oregon country, that's American land. A whole bunch of those states can be formed in that area. What do they all have to be? They all have to be free states. How much space does the South have to create below the 3630 line? Arkansas. That's it. Basically, the South can get one more slave state and all the other states will be free states. Then the North can basically bully the slave states at that point. That's the thought process. So this is why it looks like after the Missouri Compromise, there's really no ability for slavery to expand anymore. And this is why the North accepts this, allowing Missouri to be a slave state, is after the Missouri Compromise, it really doesn't look like slavery can expand anywhere else. That's very important because our future stories are going to contradict that a little bit. All right, so remember the 3630 line, very pivotal for this course and the lessons that we'll have this unit. So the question is, how did the Missouri Compromise, though it added an additional slave state, really limit the ability of slavery to expand in the future? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So this is a pretty straightforward concept that happens right here. It's very famous in American history. There's not any real cool, awesome stuff to talk about with it because it goes pretty smoothly. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe is the president in 1823. He sees Europe recovering. Europe likes to colonize stuff. So America, we feel like we've done beat England twice. Europe's always at war with themselves. Well, Europe has recovered from war and they're very healthy. And America knows that Europe is a very strong, formidable opponent. America is stronger than the South American countries, especially these countries like Brazil that have declared their independence from Portugal, like Mexico that declared their independence, even though Mexico is not in South America, it's south of us, declared their independence from Spain, as did like Colombia and these other Spanish-speaking areas in South America that were owned by Spain. America is stronger than those countries over here in our hemisphere. America in the Western Hemisphere is the strongest country on this side of the globe. We want to abuse all these countries around us and basically force them to do whatever we want them to do. We want to be the big bullies on the block. We are afraid England and France and the rest of Europe might try to come back over here now that they are strong and willing to and capable of fighting again and taking back over these South American countries that they lost. And then we have to deal with them, and we can't bully European countries the same way we can South America. So the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe comes out and he is talking to Europe. He says, hey, I got a statement for you guys. And it's called the Monroe Doctrine. He says, all this junk here, talking about North and South America, this is ours. It's America. We're not coming to get, so the first thing he says is, we're not getting involved in your problems. We're not getting involved in your foreign affairs. We're not picking sides. We're staying out of everything. That's number one. Number two, if you still have a colony over here, America will acknowledge that it exists. I'll give you an example. Spain still owns the island of Cuba. America's like, Spain, we're not trying to pick a fight with you. We're not telling you you have to not have Cuba. You're cool. Cuba just can't expand. And you can't come have any new colonies over here. But since you already have Cuba, like, that's fine. We're just saying you can't have new colonies after this statement we're making right now. And then the third one is no new colonization. And if anybody in Europe comes and messes with anybody in the New World, anybody in this hemisphere, we will fight you. This sounds almost like America is trying to be nice to South America. Like, we got your back, buddy. But in actuality, America is just making sure we can be the main bully in this hemisphere against these countries and like demand favorable trade and things like that. And it's going to create some growing hostility over time between America and these countries that we are straight up bullies to in South America. But it all starts with the Monroe Doctrine. So the question here is, what was the motivation for James Monroe to issue the Monroe Doctrine to the countries of Europe at this time? Like, basically what was happening? Why would he do it now and not previously? And then how does the Monroe Doctrine benefit America? All right, answer that completely. See you guys tomorrow.